evening all, and welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, radio and online. Coming up on the show tonight, we'll discuss a landmark ruling after the Court of Appeal overturned a judgment which declared a 19-year-old was mentally incompetent purely because she disagreed with her doctor's advice to stop life-saving treatment. Educator and author Mike Fairclough will be here to talk about how a return to traditional teaching might help better educate young men. And in similar vein, I'll also be joined by successful YouTuber and author Cameron McGregor. His channel Men and the City is about embracing a changed world for modern men. All of that and plenty of discussion with my brilliant panellist, the journalist and financial expert Jasmine Birtles. But first, an update on the latest news headlines. Something is rotten in the state. I could say something is rotten in the state of Britain, but it applies all over. Metastasised rot. People everywhere are daily made angrier, more scared of each other, when they would do better to be angry with the rotten state and the rotten state we're in on account of it. Build back better. Remember that codswallop. Nothing gets better. Instead, crisis follows crisis, war follows war, erosion of freedom follows erosion of freedom. It's plain to anyone who's looking that the pitiful leaders, puppeticians, cause the problems and then offer pre-prepared solutions that benefit only them and those pulling their strings. Are you as free as before? As free as you want to be? Are you happy? Are you well? Are you confident about your children's future? And if not, why not? Why would you put up with this rotten state? We're told we live in a world of technological and pharmaceutical solutions to all ills. We're also told war is peace. It's all lies and doublespeak. I say it's unmistakable and undeniable that something somewhere has gone badly wrong, probably long ago, and that a succession of unwanted leaders only make matters worse. We're offered and then made to endure the worst possible leaders at the worst of times. For years now, the craven mouthpieces of the state have pushed a relentlessly anti-human agenda. American author Eric Hoffer said in The True Believer that no one can be honourable unless he honours mankind. People, we are told, fellow human beings, are the ultimate problem, requiring the ultimate solution, which is to say fewer of us, save the planet, and to hell with the people alive on it here and now. Some of the richest and therefore most influential people talk casually about there being too many of us alive in the world at one time. How dare they? Who are these people who stand in judgment, presuming to make decisions about who has a right to be here? They preach the need for smaller, colder, hungrier lives for all of us from the decks of super yachts and the steps of private jets. Global population reduction has been an objective of the West since at least the 1970s. And I do mean at least. Henry Kissinger drove such an agenda while advising US President Gerald Ford. He said that population control policy requires both high-level attention and continuing review and updating. It observes that US efforts must be undertaken in such a way as to minimise criticism. It's been there in the background or even in the foreground ever since. Population reduction equals anti-human. Anyone who says that fewer people are the solution to the problem is a psychopath. We've somehow enabled an environment, an ecosystem in which psychopaths thrive and prosper. Agenda 2030 is in part the continuation of the same Malthusian eugenicist attitudes that are never far away, final solutions. It's an agenda that is anti-human almost by definition, given that achievement of the global goals of Agenda 2030 will likely lead to billions of deaths by starvation and by the pestilence and chaos that travel alongside man-made hunger. Birth rates are falling all over the world already and have been for generations. Too few babies are born, and so indigenous populations are disappearing. In the 1960s, Americans were having, on average, 3.65 children. By now it's 1.66. And still, the powers that be insist there are too many of us. People are the problem, we're told. People are the problem right enough, but not the billions at the bottom of the pyramid, rather the few thousands at the top. Since 2020, we've been made to listen to talk of a great reset, a new world order led by Davos man and his pampered ilk. There's something horribly casual about all of this. A casual disregard for human life, a casual disregard for humanity itself. The implicit message we're fed is that since there are too many people, too many of the wrong sort of people at least, that many of those people are therefore expendable. As a consequence, life has got cheap, or even cheaper than before. What's a few 100,000 men and boys cold in the clay of Ukraine? What's a few tens of thousands of women and children in Gaza? Our leaders like war. We can tell this because they keep pouring the fuel of money onto the fires of wars burning now in Ukraine, in the Middle East and elsewhere. Our economies literally thrive on death and destruction, courtesy of the military-industrial complex. They talk blithely about more war with Russia, with China, with Iran, with North Korea. Peace has been made a dirty word. And so there's talk too of fresh armies, bigger armies, more bodies. There's talk too of civil war all over the West, internecine strife, civil unrest, stoked by those that thrive and seek to gain from chaos. Mass migration around the world is a symptom of the metastasising cancer of chaos. People have been on the move from countries ruined by Western interference, ruined by invasion, by bombing, by engineered regime change. As the people up and move, our rotten leaders respond to the upheaval by throwing open the doors, dissolving borders, defaming indigenous populations as intolerant in the face of the arrival of strangers, their arrival by the millions, sowing more chaos. For years now, decades, we the people all over the world have been put on edge, set at each other's throats. Black against white against brown, Christian against Muslim against Jew. People bleed and die, homes and businesses burn. The rich just get richer and the powerful just gain more power. On the eve of Britain's entry into the First World War, Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey uttered his famous line, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." Grey was going blind then, so that it's not clear which descending darkness he was referring to, but he saw darkness coming just the same. As a consequence of disregard for the sanctity of every human life, we're surrounded by a gathering darkness. The casual, anti-human nature of our leaders and of the states they profess to lead, states made rotten by our leaders' corruption, is undeniable and unavoidable. Something is rotten in the state, and the stink of it comes from our leaders. A fish rots from the head, as they say. In search of the source of the stink, we shouldn't look from side to side at each other, but up above, among the so-called elite. They would have us lose sight of what it really means to be human and alive. Instead of valuing one another, the possibilities therein, they would prefer that we fear one another and so make that happen. Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis said, "The myriad cultures of the world make up a web of spiritual life and cultural life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as indeed is the biological web of life." In a talk he gave in 2010, he told his audience that at the time they were born, there were 6,000 languages spoken on the planet, but that by then, by 2010, only half of those survived. Every 2 weeks or so, a language dies, apparently. An elder dies, and with him or her is lost forever a whole way of comprehending reality. Davis said every language is not just a vocabulary and a grammar, but rather a flash of the human spirit. He said every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed, a thought, an ecosystem of spiritual possibilities. We should be better than we're being made now. Davis speaks about the Kogi people of Colombia who regard themselves as the elder brothers of the world and see us, the younger, unwise brothers, responsible for destroying the world. The so-called green agenda is the industrialised destruction of the world, right enough. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, records the stuff of intangible cultural heritage around the world, rather than things that can be touched, architecture, artefacts, art. The intangibles are what people know and only carry in their heads and hearts. So, folklore, cuisine, customs, beliefs, traditions, knowledge, language. With every single human being lost or left unborn, we lose something else intangible, which is their contribution, great or small. Any man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Instead of the poet's kindly thoughts, inclusive in the true and uncorrupted sense of the word, we are given to believe that fewer people is better, that less of us is more. This is a sinister and insidious philosophy, a bitter seed sown, and we're already reaping the harvest. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. I fail to see how anyone could look at our world now and say it's on the path to a good place. I fail to see how anyone could look at our leaders and say they are the ones to follow to that good place. Corrupt trees and evil fruit, that's what they are, and that's what we get. In this 21st century world of Agenda 2030 and the rest of the anti-human agenda, we're growing more and more casual about the prospect. In fact, what our leaders evidently regard as the necessity that the planet be rid of billions of us once and for all. I'm sickened by constantly hearing about the deaths of children, whether it be in ones and twos and threes, or by the tens of thousands. Children dying is what happens when society is rendered anti-human at every level. Here's the thing. If the anti-humanists get their way, if they inflict upon us their one-size-fits-all, top-down, all-powerful, all-controlling, one-world government, we will have been rendered into a homogeneous monoculture, denied our individuality and our humanity. If they meet their objectives, we will be fewer, we will be poorer, and we will have been remade in their empty image, the image of those who see themselves as nothing less than gods, and we as nothing more than dots on a spreadsheet of profit. Wade Davis said something else about how the other people of the world are not failed attempts at being us, that on the contrary, every culture is a unique set of answers to the question of what it means to be human and alive. If we would save the world, it will entail endeavouring to see each other as parts of the solution. If we would save the world, we will have to save every last one of us. Joining me this week for the duration of the show, friend and journalist Jasmine Birtles. Lovely to see you as always, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Do you feel that there's something rotten somewhere, that we've lost the love of life?
Yes, I agree so much. And you know, I was picking up some of the biblical references there because I do feel that we are in a time of revelation. And as I listen to you talking about the human and saving the human, my sense of saving the human is getting it back into the divine. I think when we separated ourselves and our sense of life, our sense of humanity from divinity, then we set ourselves on a path of destruction and darkness. I'm thinking, Václav Havel said once that when a nation loses God, it finds itself under this mega machinery. Of course, he was in a communist regime, so he knew about mega machinery. But he was saying that at that time and now, man is trying to make himself like God, but actually he is then subjected to this mega machinery, which is kind of where we are at now. As you say, it's inhuman. It sees us as dots on a screen, nothing more. It sees us very much as expendable. We're a nuisance, and it's cruel. Whereas if we go back to as more of the sense of the divine, I'm thinking, the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which says all sorts of things. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. It talks about turning the other cheek, loving your neighbour and loving your enemies as well as your neighbour. If we could all each do just a little tiny bit of that, each of us doing a tiny bit of that would make a massive difference. And I do think that and our own desire for good, for light, if each individual person can do whatever we can, however hopeless we feel that it might be, but to do whatever we can to get more of that light, more of that humanity embraced in divinity, then each one of us will together make a big difference. We really will. I don't think that it's hopeless at all.
I think that's lovely what you said, and I agree completely. I wonder, why didn't we see it coming? We've had centuries, really, of replacing meaning and humanity with technology and machinery.
Yes.
It's not as though we couldn't have seen that when you eventually nudge machines into the predominant place, that there will be a disregard for us messy biological
human beings. Yes, I agree. I think much of it has been a gradual hypnosis. We haven't realised we've had entertainment, we've had an increase of convenience. The road to hell is paved with convenience, as we know. You've got convenience, you've got entertainment, music. I mean, I remember the Ayatollah Khomeini back in the day saying that pop music was the opiate of the people or something along those lines. And I thought, actually, yeah, he's got a point. I mean, I was, I was pretty young at the time, but I thought it's a good point. We've got that. We had sexualization of society, adults and now children. We've had all kinds of distractions, sort of going, look, shiny, don't forget about, what's the reality of what's really happening. Shiny. So I think it's been one big mass hypnosis. And I have to say, I am so grateful for what I call the blessed COVID, for opening my eyes to a whole load of stuff, not just, the lies. Yes, isn't it? The irony, absolutely. And I keep calling it the blessed COVID because it's like, everything is sort of falling apart, all these layers upon layers of gunk. You go, well, that's lies, and I've believed all of this all of my life, and now I can see, obviously it's lies. Duh, what was I doing?
The final big push to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, and ironically,
yes,
it turned a bright light.
Yes, it did.
What? You're doing what? What?
Yes.
OK, we're on the break already, after which I'll be discussing the landmark ruling in the Court of Appeal in the sad case of Sudiksha Tirumalish with a member of her legal counsel, the lawyer Roger Kushka. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Last year, a 19-year-old girl known to the world only as ST was told that she was delusional for wanting to fight for her life rather than have her life-sustaining treatment withdrawn. Only after her death was ST named as Sudiksha Tirumalish and her story properly told. Sudiksha had been struggling with a degenerative mitochondrial disorder and was hoping experimental treatment in Canada could save her life. But doctors from the University Hospital's Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust said that it was in her best interests that life-sustaining treatment be withdrawn. This week, though, in a landmark ruling, the Court of Appeal overturned the decision of the Court of Protection, which declared that Sudiksha lacked mental capacity to make decisions about her medical treatment. I'm joined now by human rights lawyer and legal counsel to the Christian Legal Centre, Roger Kushka. Thank you, Roger, for making time for us.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Roger, when this story it was brought to my attention last year, I thought it couldn't be true. I thought that can't be right. That can't be happening to a person who is of age, has been declared medically sound by independent psychiatrists. She wants to keep on fighting, and she's been told that's no longer her decision to make. And yet that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it blows the mind, really. This was a young lady who was successfully completing her A-levels. She had the strength and the will to live. She had said all along that she wants to die trying to live. She was well aware of the pain, the suffering, because she was going through it, yet she still wanted to live and get that treatment in Canada. She had 2 consultant psychiatrists vouch for her competency. There was no psychiatrist on the other side saying she wasn't competent, yet the Court of Protection took the side of the clinicians and not the psychiatrists, merely because she wouldn't accept their diagnosis. And that alone, they suggested, was a sign of mental incompetence.
Exactly. I mean, it beggars belief that all this time later, a subsequent decision has been made that, well, no, that was a mistake and she was right all along. That decision of the Court of Protection at the time, did that set a kind of precedent? Or was that already a precedent that was there based on, previous decisions?
Well, I mean, it's a good question because the Court of Appeal kind of gives a mixed message on that, saying that the Court of Protection was following precedent, but it was doing so in a sense incorrectly. And so they reset what the precedent should be, and that is that the Mental Capacity Act provides a presumption of mental capacity that has to be overturned. And in this case, it wasn't. I mean, the issue is the Court of Protection is so secretive. And Sadiqa was one person who was willing to raise her voice and make some noise. We don't know how many other families have gone through exactly the same. So what this judgment does, what this new precedent does, is she will help all the people in the future who disagree with their doctor's choice to remove their care, and they'll have their own choice on the presumption of mental capacity.
Bear with me, Roger, while I turn to my guest in the studio as well. Jasmine, it begs the question, have we really reached a point where others in positions of authority are more empowered to make decisions about our lives and deaths than we are?
Yes.
Even when we have been declared of sound mind.
Yeah, and I think it is, and it's a very worrying trend. And it does feel to me part of another worrying trend, which is towards euthanasia rather than life. And we're seeing this across the West, particularly in places like Canada. But on Friday, the Lords were discussing the potential to bring in a law where if you've been given 6 months to live, you can automatically have state-assisted suicide. Now, that, if that's allowed, and I totally understand people wanting to have that, but if that is put in law, that opens the doors to all sorts. I mean, you can have doctors having a little bit of pressure put on them going, we need some more beds. And then they can sort of make a pronouncement that it's going to be 6 months. And it may be true, it may not be. Doctors are regularly wrong and regularly do things that they shouldn't do. So all of this, I think it's like being presumed guilty before being found innocent. We should be promoting life before promoting death.
Roger, clearly this most recent decision overturned the mistake of the past. But do you detect, as Jasmine says, a drift in the wider world, in Canada, here and elsewhere, towards, dying, being favoured over living?
I mean, you look at Archie Battersby, you look at Althea Evans, Charlie Gard, and now Sadiqa, and all these cases that have happened in recent memory. And you think about all the times that Parliament has tried to push through assisted suicide, and not once has it tried to fix the Court of Protection and the lack of secrecy. And one of the big issues here is Sadiqa wanted to tell her story. She wanted the Crown funds so she could make the money necessary to go to Canada. Yet there was reporting restrictions, not to protect her, but to protect the people who wanted to end her care. And as a direct result of that, I mean, even had they found her mentally competent but kept those restrictions in place, she wouldn't have been able to finance that trip to Canada. So the whole system, in a lot of ways, is broken and needs fixing.
I think the question that really troubles me most of all is who benefited from making a decision that a 19-year-old woman who had been declared of sound mind by 2 independent psychiatrists, who benefited from that determined, secretive decision that she would be better off dead, and that decision was made for her by others? Who? Cui bono?
It's a tragic question, and I just, it makes me think, how dated do the people involved in that case have to be that they can't even understand that someone would want to live, that their presumption is that it's better to die? Why didn't they take hope away from that young lady who was so courageous in wanting to live? And I agree with you. In all of these cases that I mentioned, it's just tragic. It leaves you jaded and wondering, what is up with the world we live in today?
I dread to think how her family must have reacted to this. In some ways, hearing that the mistake was made that led against her wishes to the death of your daughter or your sister or whoever, hearing that was a mistake is almost worse. I can imagine you'd almost want to be reassured that the right decision was taken. But after the death, to be told, we shouldn't have done that, that's the worst outcome. How on earth do they internalise that and find a way ahead?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll do it right here and right now. I'm calling on the government to open an inquiry into her death, into the Court of Protection, how these procedures are used to. I mean, we don't have de facto euthanasia in this country, but this is de jure euthanasia. Let's make no qualms about that. And there should be an inquiry open as to why that's possible in this country.
Roger Krichka, I will only and always have questions about what happened to that young woman. But thank you very much indeed for making the time and making plain some of what happened in the last year or so. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Coming up next, educator, teacher, head teacher, author Mike Fairclough will be here to talk about how a return to traditional teaching might help better educate young men as they look for somewhere to turn in always troubled times. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. I'm a dad. I've got 3 kids, a daughter and 2 sons. I want to talk about what is plainly a crisis that's, been manufactured for masculinity. Everywhere you look in the news at the moment, from Southport to Southend, we see images of men, some of them older, some of them younger, but all of them apparently lost in the maelstrom of it all. Whether you look at education, employment, or addiction rates, or suicide attempts, it's not a pretty picture. Certainly not for men, especially, also undeniable, white working class young men. So what can be done about turning boys into traditional men of old? I'm joined now by author and educator Mike Fairclough. Mike resigned from his head teaching post in East Sussex last year, saying he'd been discriminated against, harassed and bullied for his unorthodox approach to education. It's great to see you, Mike.
Good to see you too, Neil.
This is a challenge for all of us, I think. Parents, teachers, society at large. Now, I think you've got a thesis about there being a deliberate, controlled demolition of society that's been going on account of wider behaviour and the curriculums in our schools. I wonder if you could develop that thesis for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been an educator in primary schools for 30 years. And over the 3 decades, I've seen a kind of steady decline in several things. One, in the sort of quality of teachers coming into the profession. So the intellectual bar has been lowered considerably. And there's also been the introduction of ideologies such as the gender ideology and a real massive kind of emphasis as well on mental health, but in a way which exaggerates and emphasizes people's weaknesses. So, for example, there seems to be this huge fear and demonization of anxiety. Now, anxiety is something that children and adults feel every single day about something. It's just a natural way that we live. But the idea is that if you kind of, within the education sector, the more that it's looked at, there's this idea that it's somehow going to go away, and it simply doesn't. So my educational philosophy, and I was a head teacher for 20 years, and throughout that time, it was on a state-funded school in Eastbourne called Westrise Junior School, and I ran a farm, 120-acre farm as well, alongside the usual curriculum. Taught the children to shoot 410 shotguns, air rifles. Some of them would skin rabbits, pluck pigeons. Every single child would learn to light a fire and cook over an open fire.
It sounded brilliant, Mike. It sounded brilliant. Yeah. Every time I read about your school, it sounded more like a summer holiday than a school. I loved the thought of it.
Yeah. But what happened was COVID was I think we were making great progress, actually, by the way, and we were at top of the league tables in many areas of the curriculum, etc., and had wide praise as well from the Guardian to the Telegraph to the Times, whatever. I could literally do anything, actually. But during the pandemic and school closures, this sort of woke ideology was ramped up massively, and I've not seen a return to where we were going since that time. So, for example, character education, which is where my expertise is. So this is the building of resilience and getting children to move beyond their comfort zones in order to get stronger and to find the inner resources they need in order to tackle any of life's challenges. There seems to have been this sort of that's been set back massively from school closures, but then this sort of entrenching of woke ideology. So I mean, a massive part of that, of course, is the lack of any sort of role models, which I think are inspiring, particularly to boys. So I draw on the mythological hero's quest. So, for example, Odysseus and any of those kind of great Greek myths, or some heroes from history or who are alive today, such as Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, or back in history to have Dr. Martin Luther King, etc. Men who inspire empowerment. And I feel like what children and young people are being offered at the moment are not empowered, inspiring people. They are generally weak and confused, and the whole thing just creates more of the same. So confused and weak children. And what your guest earlier was talking about, the kind of back in the day sort of World War II sort of heroes. And I'm fortunate because my paternal father, so my dad's dad, fought in the Somme, the Battle of the Somme in World War I, with the Cameron Highlanders. So I grew up with stories of resilience and bravery and freedom fighting. My headmaster at school was a World War II veteran. He fought in North Africa in World War II. And, I had all of these wonderful, resilient men around me sharing stories which inspired the same thing in me, which is why I think I was the only head teacher or school principal out of 43,500 in the entire United Kingdom to publicly question the COVID vaccine rollout to children. And this isn't, I'm not going off topic here, but the fact that I know other head teachers, men, who shared my concerns but publicly didn't share them shows how far we've fallen as a society when men can't stand up for their communities, and that's what we need to get back to.
Hang on, Mike, I'm just going to involve Jasmine here in the studio. Jasmine, do you agree with that thesis? And furthermore, do you agree that boys, I think in particular, seem to be being ill-served? Yes,
and it does seem to be deliberate. I mean, we're seeing a feminisation of society in a wrong way. I speak as a female. There's a weird sort of feminisation, the transgender element. We're telling boys that being masculine is toxic. Whatever you do, it's toxic. We're not, as you said, we're not giving them proper role models. This sense of these good qualities like bravery, standing for principle, morality. And if these other head teachers had those elements and were themselves trying to live them, loads of them would have spoken out and we would have had a very different situation.
It would have been so different if any one collective group, like, for example, the teachers, had all come forward and said, not in my school, then the narrative, the flow of that narrative could have changed considerably. I'm up against a break, but Mike Fairclough's going to stay with us. We're going to pick this conversation up, develop it, but I have to go into a break. I'll also be joined by YouTuber and author Cameron McGregor. We'll be continuing the discussion. His channel, Finance, Freedom and Neo-Masculinity, is about embracing a changed world for the modern man. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, where we are continuing our discussion about men and the role of men in today's world. and I want to talk about the manosphere, described by my next guest as a revolt against a broken society. Cameron McGregor has a YouTube channel called Men and the City. It's a channel about finance, freedom and neo-masculinity. It's about embracing a changed world for modern men. And Cameron joins me now from Buenos Aires. Hello, Cameron. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Neil. Well, from one to another, thanks for hosting me on your program. I look forward to the conversation.
Oh, good. Now, I'll ask you right off the top. Buenos Aires, I have to say, is somewhere that I would associate with a more traditional kind of masculinity, perhaps, than we're used to in our own metropolitan areas. Is that the case, or is that just a myth?
Well, I would say yes and no. One of the things about Buenos Aires, where I am now, it's a very literate society. That's a very good thing. People are active readers. It tends to be more intellectual. The downside of that is the Marxist influence is also very strong. So feminism is actually stronger down here than you might think.
Okay. Now, I've been paying a lot of attention to what you've been saying online recently, and amongst other strands, I picked up on the idea that, with an optimistic point of view, really, you're seeing a resurgence of masculinity manifesting, let's say, in younger men, realising that the time has come for them to pick up their share of the responsibility and the burden for making society better and getting on with it. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think so. Well, we need to give a little bit of context for where we stand today. I'd say there's three main precursors that have brought men to the point of what I call neo-masculinity, which is really about three things. It's about revolt, it's about resurrection, as you put it, and it's about reform. And that is a Marxist turnover of institutions that really started in the 1960s. I know that's a subject you're well versed in. Singularly targeted Western civilization for destruction, and importantly, the standard bearers of Western civilization, whom they have identified as men and masculinity. The second precursor, I would say, or cause, is the deindustrialization and financialization of the economy that began largely in the 1970s when the US dollar decoupled from gold and systematically deindustrialized. When that happened, the socioeconomic power of men was sort of stripped bare because we were the human capital that powered that industrial capacity. And the third, and perhaps the most important cause, is mass immigration. It's the weaponization of immigration such that open borders and demographic replacement have reprioritized the interests of immigrants at the expense of local native-born populations. Men have borne the brunt of that social scarring, particularly young men, especially since the global financial crisis in 2008. And so young men who've been villainized by institutions have been forced out of mainstream society and into a kind of parallel community, the manosphere being sort of the umbrella term. And it is in the manosphere where men are reconciling the extent of damage that's been done to the West and coming to grips with the fact that we need fundamental reform and we need a more empowered masculinity to implement that reform.
And it's wonderful to hear that idea, because I hear implicit within it the idea that especially younger men, the generations coming through, are looking on at what surrounds them and what has gone before them, and rather than surrendering to it and buckling under it, this sense that you've identified of them seeing, no, the time has come to put our shoulder to the wheel. If the politicians are useless, we should get into politics. If the bureaucracies and the entities of state are rotten at the core, we will put ourselves into that and make them better.
Yeah, that's precisely correct. And it goes beyond the manosphere. I would include the Bitcoin community as a part of this. There is a ferocious commitment to reform across the board. So in the Bitcoin community, there is a recognition that the financial system, root and branch, is broken and needs to be overhauled. In the manosphere, there's a recognition that the gender imbalance, the toxicity between the genders has gotten out of control, and we need reform. At a minimum, we know that divorce rates in the United States, for instance, are over 50%, but 80% of custody is rewarded to mothers rather than fathers. So there is an impetus for reform there. It's also evident in the alternative media complex, which is increasingly committed to free speech and uncovering the corruption and inefficiency that beleaguers a lot of Western governments. So the impetus for reform is strong, and it's getting stronger.
Bear with me, Cameron, while I talk to my guest in the studio, Jasmine Birtles. Now, you're a finance expert as well. It's a fascinating concept, no? A renaissance, an accepting of responsibility by especially young men that finance is broken, the economies are broken, politics is broken, and the time has come.
It's marvellous. It's really exciting to hear, because, you know, what we do need is, as you say, a resurgence of effort. We need genuine morality. And you know, I said this earlier, but what we as women are looking for is really men who will man up in terms of standing for principle, not, you know, going and fighting a bear. I mean, that's great if they can do that, but a braver thing to do is to stand for principle, to stand and say what is right when everybody else is shouting at you that you're wrong. And this is what we need. And if we have more of these, and we don't have to have millions, just you know, a good solid team of them doing this, then they can change things. They really genuinely can make a genuine difference to politics, to the world, and to us individually.
Cameron, I'm sure you were listening to what Jasmine had to say there. I'm also, my earlier guest, I don't know if you heard any of what Mike Fairclough had to say. He's a teacher, an educator, and he is, well, frankly, in despair, really, about the way in which the curriculum had evolved in this country. You know, he sees a sort of a deliberate demolition of society, and he's sensitive to what especially was happening to, you know, to men in this country, to poor working class white boys especially, being given a very negative message. Education, how does that face a resurrection in the manosphere?
Yeah, I mean, there is a recognition across the board, not just in the United States, I think across Western Europe as well, that educational institutions, some of the best institutions, especially the Ivy League schools, have been completely subverted and destroyed over the last several decades. And so they have invested, and you're starting to see figures like Jordan Peterson emerge, who has become the sort of intellectual vanguard of a counter thrust in a new direction. And as I said, this is only going to get stronger. I would also add something else. What we're experiencing today is not simply the residue of some very bad ideas that have been institutionalized and weaponized against men. It's also a leadership vacuum. That's what you're seeing unfold in the United States. It's not clear who's running the White House. It's not clear who's directing our foreign policy. I think you're seeing a similar development in Germany and in France, where you have coalition governments that don't have a clear direction forward. There is a vacuum of power of sorts, and men, I think, are organizing to fill that vacuum.
Cameron, this is a conversation that we're going to keep going immediately following this. But I've got to just let my television audience know at the moment that that's the end of that TV hour. But stay tuned on GB News for the brilliant Free Speech Nation. We have more content online. Neil Oliver Show continues. We'll be discussing with Cameron McGregor and with Mike Fairclough. We'll be talking about the manosphere. We'll be talking about the resurgence of the male. We'll be talking American politics with Greg Swenson and the escalating tensions in the Middle East with Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. Don't miss any of it. I will see you here next week. Welcome everyone joining me on GB News Online. I'll be continuing the discussion with Cameron McGregor. Rejoining us too is Mike Fairclough for discussing the role of men in society and how we need to get back to basics when it comes to teaching men to be men. Mike Fairclough, I'll come to you first. In this instance, I'm hoping that you were able to hear some of what Cameron McGregor was saying. Now, I look around me at what's being offered to boys, certainly, but to wider society. And I looked, for example, at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games and all of the controversy there, all of the elements of that seemed to be a tragedising and a mocking of Christian values. I wonder, where was the simple celebration of regular family in all of that, especially when you think about the Olympics and you think that the vast majority of those athletes, male and female, would have spent their youth, their childhoods being taken to training by mum and dad. And yet there didn't seem to be any inclusion of that in the way in which a global spectacle was being offered to kids.
Yeah, so that wasn't the only dreadful thing that happened. Obviously, like sort of fat transgender people who are clearly not athletes opening the Paris Olympics makes no sense at all. But we also had Angela Carini being beaten up by a man, in a boxing match. And but what we've actually found is that there's a huge amount of self-censorship, because if you speak to people out in the street, anyone really, about gender ideology or what's a boy, what's a girl, all of these sorts of things, or talk about old school values and manners and being a gentleman, all of that kind of thing, most people have got the same opinion regardless of what culture they're from or what country they're from or their class. Most people are like, well, that's a boy, that's a girl, etc., etc. But what we found over, and it's really ramped up since the kind of COVID era, is people self-censoring out of fear of reprisals from others. So to question the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics is to make you a bigot and a transphobe, for example, and the same to condemn the beating of Angela Carini. And it's interesting, actually, it seems to be empowered women who are standing up against a lot of this stuff, like J.K. Rowling, who's been really outspoken about the dreadful boxing incident. But what we do need is more men standing up, and that's why I feel like we can see this in a positive way as us men being called to our mythological quest. So seeing it as, of course, there's all the resistance. No one wants to be attacked and called names, and like in my situation, to have sort of like livelihood and reputational damage, etc., etc. But if you see it within a broader picture of, right, okay, this is our spiritual battle. This is our call to the quest. We're going to go on this quest, and we may not, as an individual, succeed, but if you go deeply into that kind of vibe of really embracing the challenge, moving beyond the comfort zone, what we actually find is we tend to find the inner resources we need in order to cope with it, and we can do something about it. But fundamental to making this change is for people to embrace two things: critical thinking and freedom of speech. You think critically about things like, is this right? Is this wrong? What are my views? And then to express them without pretending that it's going to be easy, because it isn't when you talk about controversial things or politically sensitive topics. But that's what's needed. And I feel that this resurgence of the masculine, I mean, you can see that within society. There are loads of blokes are blokes and like cracking on with it. But we need those guys also to use their voices and stand up and to be counted in this, what I would regard as a spiritual battle.
Cameron, spiritual battle, mythic quest. Also, as Jasmine Birtles was saying earlier, this sense that women want men to be taking that responsible role alongside them. This must be music to your ears, I would have thought.
Yeah, look, I think this sentiment is powerful. I think it's prevailing. I think it's growing. And I don't think it's gendered specifically to men either. I think there's a growing sense of anxiety across the Western world that things are sort of sliding into disarray and chaos. That being said, I look at things a little bit differently. I think we're at the end of a cycle, the end of a period of nihilism, of disorientation, of anything goes, which has sort of blown itself off in a financial explosion of debt. That debt is beginning to liquidate, and hard times are coming. Hard times are going to provide the rock solid foundation for a better world, but it's going to require men to reactivate, to re-engage with that world. And that's what I'm starting to see. The self-censorship is a very serious problem, but in the United States, what's worse is political censorship. The good news is that there are powerful forces that are beginning to push back. That's one of the reasons why Elon Musk bought Twitter. We have figures in the media like Tucker Carlson and others that are beginning to hold governments accountable for censoring dissident voices. And I think Europeans experience a very similar kind of problem, maybe even worse, and are looking to the United States in that sense to create the conditions for them to speak up as well.
And Jasmine, here with me in the studio, there's a very strong sense also, Jasmine, that it's men and women together have to do this. You know, men can't fix it, women can't fix it. And the whole point, in a sense, is that women together, in their active roles, are the collective answer to all of the problems.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, as you were talking about the leadership vacuum. I mean, it's ironic in a sense that in this country, I think we haven't had a truly tough leader since Margaret Thatcher. You know, that was a person, whether you agree or not with her policies, she had them, she stuck with them, and, you know, everybody could throw what they liked at her, but she stuck with it. And this is something that both men and women can and should have. And certainly, you know, we've talked about parenting, and that's what genuinely good parenting does. That it doesn't try to just be friends with the kids. They stand on principle, and however much screaming and shouting there is, they do what is right. And, you know, if you have to do this, you have to do that. And this is what we do need more. And I do agree about the financial situation, that as soon as the money goes, and it is going, and it's going to go very fast at some point, it'll go very slowly and then it'll go very fast, then we get a big sense of reality. And it's certainly something that we need in this country, where we have at least 7 million people simply not working. It's very much something we need in the United States, where there are some serious problems with people, you know, just not doing what they should be doing. So it'll be interesting to see.
Cameron, it's an interesting juxtaposition, I think, that perhaps not many people would just automatically make, that it's a financial collapse and a moral collapse that has manifested maybe in the masculine more than in the feminine. But those two things together, it's interesting to hear those two things being held up as foundational pillars of functioning society.
Yeah, what's noteworthy about that is that the financial system is an abstraction, right? It's simply digits on a screen at this point, and it's very dehumanized. It's devoid of the human imprint on society. I mean, what's carried the stock market forward, for instance, over the last year or so, is the notion that artificial intelligence is somehow going to provide the panacea for all of our social problems. Of course, that's absurd. We have very serious human problems, some of which we're talking about on this program in terms of the disruption between men and women, but it is in human beings where these problems are going to be solved. And as the financial system has disoriented or decoupled from the human system it's supposed to represent, now you're beginning to see real social consequences for that. The real danger in this situation, Neil, is that what we're discussing is completely missing from the discourse across Western governments. There's no concept of it whatsoever. If anything, they regard what we're talking about as a threat to their power. And so that means they're only going to make the situation worse and create the conditions for the counter thrust that we're talking about.
Necessary resurgence and renaissance, and I hope you're all right. Thank you so much, Cameron McGregor and Mike Fairclough. Jasmine's going to stay with me, but thank you. Fascinating conversation, and we will do more about that in the weeks ahead, I promise. Coming up, Kamala Harris gets a clear run as Democratic presidential nominee, and Donald Trump questions her racial identity. It's been another of those lively weeks in US politics. I'll be joined by Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas UK to discuss all of it and more. This week, Kamala Harris was given her free run at the White House when the Democrats decided not to put another presidential candidate forward. She'll now face former President Donald Trump in November's election. The Republican nominee was criticised this week for questioning whether his Democratic rival is, quote, Indian or black, close quote, at a contentious appearance at a black journalists' convention. Meanwhile, away from politics, the three men who've been imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay since 2003, accused of being behind the 9/11 attacks, have apparently agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for life sentences instead of the death penalty. Let's pick up on all those topics with Republicans Overseas UK's Greg Swenson. Thanks for joining me as always, Greg.
Great to see you, Neil.
It might sound like a strange question after all these years with Kamala Harris in vision, but how much do we know about Kamala Harris?
Neil, I think we know a lot about Kamala Harris, and I saw a poll this week that said only 4% of the voters surveyed didn't have a view or didn't know of her. So that's pretty clear that people are aware. And the question is whether they're going to remember the Kamala Harris of 2020 when she ran for president as an extreme progressive leftist, or the Kamala Harris of the last 3.5 years as vice president, where she was, walking with Biden on into all these traps, and for the most part, their policies and outcomes have been disasters. So that's the big question. But in the last week or two, we've seen, real manufactured stardom from the media. It's really phenomenal, and I think the Democrats, hats off to them. They waited till after the Republican National Convention. They waited till Trump was officially the nominee before pulling Biden on the following Sunday, only 2 days after the convention wrapped up. And since then, they've done a great job of, this psyop of kind of making Kamala Harris into someone who nobody really knew before, because, she was polling in the mid-30s, below Trump, below Biden, and probably the lowest polling numbers for a vice president historically. And yet now she's killing it. she's got real momentum. So, well done on the execution by the Democrats.
But it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that it's not a consistent picture. We were told for the longest time that she was Biden's border czar. Now, apparently, that's not the case.
Right.
She's very much standing as as a person of colour, and yet when in her legal role in California, she was an enthusiastic jailer of young black men, not to put it mildly. Yeah. She was keen to keep young black men behind bars, allegedly for cheap labour. She mocked BLM. There's all these inconsistencies about her. And then, as you say, it's undeniable, or it seems to be undeniable, that the US mainstream media have absolutely got behind Kamala, and Mr. Trump, President Trump, is being made harder to find.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's so far it's working, and then the question is whether it's going to be a sugar high. And when the scrutiny on her starts, and I don't know if that's done, it won't be done by the mainstream media, obviously, but if it's done by the Trump campaign, by television advertising, scrutinizing her. But you're right, Neil. She's changed stripes a few times, depending on the political moment, and she takes the temperature of the electorate. She's sticking with her progressive argument. She's really appealing to the Democrats. She's surely not appealing to independents and swing voters. The only thing she's really flipped on that's obvious, and I think people should be skeptical of, is she's flipped on the fracking ban. She's in an appeal to get voters in Pennsylvania. So she's reversed her view on that. But if you go back to 2020, where she was a failed candidate. She didn't even make it to the the first caucuses or primaries. She dropped out before. She was polling number 7 in South Carolina, which is a African-American Democratic base. But she was a proponent of the Green New Deal, proponent of bail reform. She was encouraging people to contribute to these bail reform agencies that were bailing out convicted criminals, especially during the BLM riots. She was for packing the court. She was for defunding the police. She uses pronouns. She frequently visits, all kinds of woke, drag queen hour kind of stuff. So, she's really a member of the progressive left. The surveys in the last few years of her Senate, when she was a senator, had her as the most liberal senator in the Senate. I mean, so these are things that it's going to be hard to bury all of those things. Although in the last 2 weeks, they've done a great job of it, and it's actually reflected in the polls.
Jasmine, what do you think the Democrats want people to see with the presentation of Kamala Harris now?
Well, it's very much a woman of colour, so she ticks a lot of boxes, but particularly the female one and the being of colour. So I think those two elements are what they're really pinning all of their hopes on, because as we've just heard, there's a lot of dodgy stuff in her background. To my mind, she doesn't come across as particularly intelligent. That's something that's been picked up by certainly, Republican laughter, the various ways that she speaks, things that she does, etc. But she is, by dint of birth, she has colour. She is a woman, and those two things, I think, will be what are pushed and pushed and pushed, and potentially will get her forward with quite a lot of voters, both Republican and who don't like Trump, and Democrats.
Greg, to move things on to matters slightly more, I suppose, more dangerous perhaps, there are those, I hear rumblings, maybe not in the mainstream media, but maybe in more alternative media, military people anxious about where she might go, in relation to, I even hear reference of a kind of an Arab Spring 2.0, an agenda that was pushed under Obama's first term. Very aggressive. We saw what happened to Libya. We saw what happened in Syria. Then in his second term, he backed off from it and sought to portray himself in a different way. I keep hearing, and should I be worried, that with Harris in the White House, if it happens, that we would be looking at, all of that, the colour revolution apparatus swinging in behind her, to get bloody again.
Yeah, you very well could. What I can tell you about Kamala Harris is that she's really obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and identity politics. That's clear. She was clearly a DEI candidate in 2020, both running for president and her selection as vice presidential nominee. So, that's obvious. The concern that we have in Washington is that that's all she cares about. And we saw that in the early days of the Biden administration. We had plenty of criticism for Biden, but at least we knew that he understood, sort of global geopolitics and the risks of, an aggressive China, the risks of an aggression anywhere, especially in the Middle East. Whereas Kamala Harris has no idea what's going on in the rest of the world. All she knows about is DEI and identity politics.
Which is dangerous in and of itself, is it not? Because that makes it sound as if there's a possibility of a factotum president in the White House who will just allow the hawks, who want to, to continue with the sort of Hillary Clinton hawkish behaviour in the Middle East and elsewhere, and get that job done, so to speak, while Kamala preoccupies herself with worrying about diversity, equity and inclusion.
That's right, and it's a real risk, and she might just farm that all out to the sort of the infrastructure in Washington, which is really worrisome. That's not why people vote for the president. That's not why they vote for the commander in chief. They want a civilian that's running the military and running the defense apparatus. So yeah, it's worrisome because she is relatively incompetent. You've seen it with the word salads. You've seen it with the decision making, the failures on the border. She was the border czar, but somehow the mainstream media here has erased the term border czar and claims that we never used that term about her. That should be on her as much as it should be on President Biden. But you had the failure at the border. That's a national security risk completely. No mention of the fentanyl, no mention of the illegals. They're just trying to somehow miraculously reverse this and blame Trump for the open border, which is hysterical. Then you have inflation. You have an energy crisis that Biden started, but surely Kamala Harris endorsed it, with her threats on the Green New Deal and banning fracking. And of course, as I mentioned, she's flipped on the fracking ban, but that's purely vote buying in Pennsylvania.
Just when you think that the race for the presidency can't get any more jaw-droppingly surprising, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Greg, there'll be more to talk about in this vein. I'll look forward to the continuation of this conversation, but thanks so far this evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Neil. Good to see you. Thanks.
Coming up, military expert Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford will join me, and we'll be talking about the assassination of a Hamas leader. Has it brought the Middle East to the brink of regional war? the assassination of, apparently, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh this week in Tehran has raised concern that the conflict in the Middle East might spread even further. Iran has threatened, quote, harsh punishment for Israel, which it claims was behind the apparent missile strike. Israel has not commented specifically, but says it has dealt crushing blows to its enemies over the last few days. I'm joined now by Defence Analyst Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. Thank you for joining me, Lieutenant Colonel Crawford.
My great pleasure, yet again.
If this was indeed the assassination of the man who, love him or loathe him, was certainly a Hamas negotiator. I think it's debated whether he was the leader or not, but he was certainly a negotiator for Hamas. If he's been eliminated, does that send out a message that negotiation, full stop, has been eliminated as well?
It's a good question, Neil. I don't think that's quite as straightforward as that. As you will be well aware, after the October 7th attacks in the Gaza Strip and into Israel, the Israeli government under Netanyahu has promised that it will eradicate Hamas as both a political and a military going concern, certainly in the Gaza Strip, and that's what it's doing. And this is part and parcel of that. You said in your intro that he was killed by an airstrike. The evidence now seems to be that he was killed by a bomb which was concealed in his bedroom, in the rooms which he has inhabited before when he's visited Tehran. So his security antennae or his advisors have not been really up to the job. This is the same modus operandi that the IRA tried to kill Margaret Thatcher with in Brighton almost exactly 40 years ago. And it's not the end of negotiations, but it's a very strong signal from Israel that all the Hamas main operatives are in fact dead men walking, and they're going to get them in the end, as they did after the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre. And it took them many, many years to get to all the perpetrators of that, but they got them all in the end.
It is also, though, it's very much a slap in the face for Iran, isn't it? This happening to this man, on their patch, is something that is very provocative for the regime, surely.
Oh, indeed, yeah. But it's absolutely extraordinary because he was actually assassinated inside what amounts to an IRGC, Revolutionary Guards compound, which they were responsible for the security for. And somehow it would appear that operatives or agents of the probably the Mossad have been able to infiltrate that and construct a bomb and hide it and put it on a timer, or more likely on a remote control detonation device. So it's hugely embarrassing for Iran, as well as being a slap in the face. And it just shows that they are not yet able to counter the ability of Israel to strike more or less at will throughout the Middle East.
We watched Netanyahu's reception in the US, in the Capitol. I think it was 58 standing ovations during the course of a 55-minute speech. Would it be fair to say that reception has emboldened Mr. Netanyahu, that he can pretty much act with impunity, do what he wants?
Well, I mean, as you're well aware, Neil, there's a huge Jewish lobby in the USA, which is why part of the reason why the USA is very much Israel's staunchest ally when it comes to confrontation in the Middle East. I don't think that will necessarily per se have emboldened the Israeli Prime Minister, because it's always been the case right back until 1948, if you want to go back that far. So Israel is secure in the knowledge that if there's ever any existential threat to its state and citizens, the USA will, by some means or other, intervene.
Jasmine Birtles, it's interesting to me that Lieutenant Colonel Crawford invokes 1948. it does seem to me that these past months, since since this conflict took fresh flame, that unquiet ghosts have been deliberately or accidentally raised by all of us. I've never heard so many people. I mean, one would expect Lieutenant Colonel Crawford to know about 1948, of course, but many people, myself included, have been reminded of it all. You know, the Deir Yassin massacre, the Nakba is a word that many more people are using now than I have ever heard previously in my lifetime. It feels like the strenuous nature of this activity, for the first time that I remember, is casting Israel as the bad guy.
Absolutely. I do think that it's been a huge PR fail on the part of Israel, and also the government of the USA in particular. So, October the 7th, there was a huge groundswell of support for Israel itself. We were shocked. But everything after that has fueled the anti-Israel sentiment across the West. I mean, I'm assuming in other parts of the world as well, but the West in particular, and you see it especially on social media, not in the mainstream media very much, but social media, you see and hear it daily. And it's one of those subjects that unless you really know what you're talking about, you keep well away from.
Lieutenant Colonel, can you? It's a question that many people ask, but I think it persists in being something that's worth contemplating. The very idea that you can obliterate, bomb out of existence a philosophy like Hamas, an ideology like Hamas, is it realistic? Or with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh and the rest, is it not just the creation of martyrs? Is it not just going to spread the ideology of Hamas further afield, and that it will, those flowers will spring up elsewhere?
Oh, it might well do, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's the case. But I think that the point is that Israel's revenge, if you like, for the October 7 attacks will have to play out in full. And after that, with Hamas both politically and militarily severely degraded, then, and it's an awful phrase to use, it may be acceptable to return to an acceptable level of violence in Gaza, the West Bank, and elsewhere in the Middle East, and just accept the fact that confrontation and conflict is going to be the norm, and there's not going to be any peace, certainly not for the next couple of generations.
Are we looking at escalation into a regional conflict? Will this pull Iran in once and for all this time, or will it at some point in the imminent future become an even bigger fire than it has already been?
Well, I think that that is not necessarily imminent, but clearly it's an escalation of what's been going on beforehand. Behind all of this, of course, both politically, militarily, and ideologically, is the confrontation between Iran and the United States. And of course, the United States is Israel's staunchest ally in the Middle East. And I've said many, many times before, and I think I've said it before in your program, that at some point, the USA is going to have to deal with Iran and this conflict of interests, hopefully using diplomatic means. And I desperately hope not by using military means. But there is a danger of the conflict escalating, certainly into a regional conflict. I don't think it's going to escalate into anything approaching a global conflict. But neither Iran nor the USA, nor indeed Israel, want that to happen because, they have other troubles to seek. They don't have their troubles to seek. And the idea of a regional war with direct conflict between Iran, the USA, and Israel is in nobody's interest.
You've talked about, obviously, the extent to which Israel is absolutely dependent upon and has always been able to rely upon the support of the United States. If Donald Trump is returned to the White House in November, he was, some people have said that as he was leaving the White House the last time, he was, as it were, stabbed in the back by Mr. Netanyahu. And, amongst Trump's publications are, The Art of the Comeback, in which he details how you bear in mind the people that, that stabbed you in the back in the past, and you go after them the first chance you get when you're on the comeback trail. Is Mr. Netanyahu contemplating a very different America in terms of American support, were former President Trump to become future President Trump?
Well, President Trump is, it's very difficult to gauge what exactly he's going to do or what he's going to say or what he's going to mean when he says something. But I think that the Israelis will be very aware of the up-and-coming presidential elections this November and the possibility that Donald Trump could be returned to the White House, although I think that that's less of a certainty than I would have said a couple of months ago. With the upsurge in support for Kamala Harris. So I don't think they know what's going to happen. And if the Middle East conflict between Israel and Iran and the proxies is going to be concluded in any sort of form, it would suit everybody for it to be done, well, it certainly suit the Israelis, for it to be done before the presidential elections, when they're still sure of American support.
Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, thank you so much for being brave enough to join me in the minefield that is, as Jasmine Birtles says, the minefield of having any kind of conversation about Israel and Palestine. Thank you for your contribution this evening. We move onwards. Don't go away, because coming up next, lecturer, commentator, thinker, friend of mine, Ralph Schulhammer, will be joining us for Hammer Time. My final guest today no longer needs any introduction from me. That said, he is lecturer, professor, commentator, and above all, thinker, Ralph Schulhammer. Lovely to see you as always, Ralph.
Good to see you, Neil. You forgot to say, and good friend.
Good friend, you're quite right. That was a dreadful, egregious wrong of me not to remind everyone of that. Yes, friend first and foremost. Ralph, I saw in the notes that you offered up earlier the name Alexis de Tocqueville. I love the way that you effortlessly lift the tenor of the academic nature of the conversation we might have. Name dropper that you are, historical name dropper. I wonder what it was about the musings of that French man of letters that caught your eye this week.
Well, I have to admit, I hope you can forgive me and hope your viewers can forgive me as well. I'm very much in a name-dropping mood today. And before I start with de Tocqueville, I'd like to start with Orwell. I know everybody always talks about Orwell, but I really went back and read him. And he had this great quote in his book where he says in 1984, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final and most essential command." And this thought has been with me over the last couple of weeks, because everything we discussed on your show and we saw on the news, like, Joe Biden's health conditions that supposedly were perfect until a couple of weeks ago, the Uniparty in the UK, the Uniparties in continental Europe, right, where people have the sense it doesn't matter if they vote left, it doesn't matter if they vote right, things never seem to change. The migration debate in the UK, right, where people can see, they can sense, we saw it recently also in Southport, that there are issues, there are problems, but the government simply negates it. The only thing I believe that Orwell got wrong was that he believed that the party, in order to have that power, must be totalitarian, it must be brutal, it must use full force against the citizens. And I think that Tocqueville got it better. He said, even in a democracy, a liberal system, it can be tyrannical, but it's not going to be tyrannical by putting you in prison, by harming your body. It leaves, as he said, it leaves the body alone and goes straight for the soul. And you know this, Neil, right? This is, as soon as you say something that is off the agreed upon narrative, think about COVID, all of a sudden you're a crank, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're an anti-Semite, you name it. And this is the combination of de Tocqueville and Orwell. We live on paper in a democratic system, but even within that system, right, you see these tyrannical pressures that really try to prevent you from speaking your mind on certain issues. And in many ways, it is, as Orwell said, we have the evidence with our eyes and ears. And I also listened to a previous guest. That's why I think that the elections in the United States are so important for us in Europe and the UK to observe, because we really saw that for 3 years, a little bit over 3 years, we were told that a person that is basically in the early or middle stage of dementia is the fittest, smartest, best suited person for president. And this is, like, we are told by the Uniparty and their allies in the media to reject the evidence of our eyes and ears. And I think this is all very, very problematic and important to talk about.
And I think that there's also the suggestion that you make that de Tocqueville actually pointed at America, even in his own time, as being somewhere that, well, one might be invited to think of it as the land of the free, a quintessentially democratic place with freedom of speech. That, on the contrary, something else, not much spoken about, perhaps not much acknowledged, was actually the truth of life in that republic.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is and to be very clear, I love the Americans. I'm a huge fan of the United States. We talked about this last week, right? I think that the promise of America is still a great one. Yeah, it goes without saying. But there is something within, and de Tocqueville observed this, almost 200 years ago, that there is a certain sense of conformity within the United States as well. And the best example of this was made by our joint friend Mark Stein in one of his earlier books, where he said he was at an airport that was shortly after 9/11, and in front of him was this, butch, well-trained guy, and he had this T-shirt that said, "Texas, don't tread on me" on it. But he was just there in the shoeless shuffle at the security line and was being pat down by the TSA, in the longest line possible. So there is this disconnect, almost a cognitive dissonance sometimes, between the self-perception of the United States and its citizens being those rebels, the rebels without a cause and willing at any time to defy authority. But in truth, even the American system and the American society is built in a way that they make sure that you conform. And I think this is something that we also see, of course, in real life happening again.
Bear with me, Ralph. I'm going to bring in Jasmine here. Jasmine, it's interesting to me that Ralph mentions an anecdote that's set in an airport, because I noticed relatively recently, really, that the airport experience is already lost. We long ago surrendered in the airport context to every kind of indignity. We shuffle. We're constantly handing over proof of our identity. We're patted down, we take our clothes off. There's the infamous genital sweep if you make the alarm go off. And we just take it. So, we shout about freedom and we shout about liberty and all of the rest of it, and yet you think, the test case is, whenever I go into an airport, be it in the UK, be it in the US, be it anywhere, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we manifest there our willingness to just submit.
Yes, and what I learned in the last 4 years, in the blessed COVID years, as I say, I call it the blessed COVID because it's opened my eyes to so much. And some of the things that it's opened my eyes to is the difference between a law and a mandate, for example, and how we have been nudged into thinking that we have to do certain things. Frankly, I don't know if it is a law that we have to take half our clothes off in the airport, that we have to take this off. We just assume that it is, in the same way that we assumed that we had to close down the churches, that we had to close down the schools. These were mandates. They weren't laws, actually. And had we known, we could have said no, and really no in a very, very clear way. Same with what I've also found out is about man's sovereignty, the sovereign project, the laws that really govern this land, the common law, as opposed to the naval law that apparently we're labouring under. So I think what is happening to those that will listen, those that will open their eyes at the moment, is a whole new sense of what our rights are. And it may take us a little while to get to that. But as with the airport idea, once we know, then we will be able to say to those in charge, no, I'm not taking my clothes off, because there's no law that says I have to, actually.
Ralph, we were talking earlier in the show we were talking in the context of education. I'm talking to a former head teacher, specifically in relation to masculinity and the education of boys. But I thought that occurred to me in the context of tyranny. I'm troubled by the way in which we have educated generations now to be just rule-obeying. And there's a terrible danger in brainwashing people that if authority says it's the rule, that good citizens obey it. And on the contrary, a moral ethical education ought to prepare people actually to critically think about what any government or administration tells them to do, evaluate it in moral terms, and perhaps, if necessary, refuse to obey that rule on the grounds that it's immoral, whether it comes from the government or anyone else. You know, there are many ways in which, aren't there, in which tyranny is slipped upon us. You know, it just envelops us like a bad smell without us even noticing.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And let me give you an example that I think embodies this quite nicely. This must have been in the 1990s in Canada. And there was a time when the Mounties, the Canadian police, was burning down the barns and meeting places of Quebec secessionists. And there was quite an uproar of people saying that this is illegal. And the then Prime Minister, it was either Chrétien or Trudeau, I'm no longer sure, forgive me. But he said, well, if people are so upset about this illegal barn burning, he's going to make it legal. And then I think George Jonas, the commentator, said, this shows you what the government gets wrong. It isn't like burning barns is not wrong because it's illegal. It's illegal because it's wrong. And I think this is the problem with nowadays. You're exactly right. We are moving into this territory, and that is a soft form of despotism and totalitarianism, where the only justification for whether or not a law is good or bad is whether or not it comes from the state. But as you correctly point out, we no longer have a conversation whether these laws are actually grounded in any kind of justifiable moral dimensional or moral idea. And going back, Jasmine, you were so right there. But I would go a step further. We basically have taken the airport idea after 9/11 and have been expanding it to all of society and then hypercharged it during COVID. And I think one of the reasons for this is, I give you just one quick other example. You know, when you have debates, everybody knows that in Europe and in the UK that stabbings are going up. And everybody has an idea why this is the cause. And so the solution by governments is, well, then we're just going to ban knives. Because if they would go to the actual root cause of why this is happening, they would have to admit that they make mistakes, that they made significant mistakes in the past. But the contemporary state, democracy or not, can no longer admit that they are making mistakes. And this is, and I'd be very provocative now, but this is very akin in some ways to a fascist ideology, because that's the kind of ideology that says that the state is the same as God, and God can never fail. God can never be wrong. And this is the same attitude we have in politics. I can give you a quick quote from the German Minister of Economics, Robert Habeck. He literally said in an interview a couple of weeks back, the state makes no mistakes. And this kind of attitude, that is a totalitarian, a quasi-fascist attitude. I'm deliberately provocative, but there is more than a kernel of truth, I believe, to what I'm saying.
Ralph Schulhammer, as always, when we talk with you, we only just begin to get into the heart of the matter when time declares that we have to, for this week at least, draw the conversation to a close. I'll speak to you again next week, though. It's always a pleasure to hear you think out loud, Ralph. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. See you soon. Bye.
Jasmine, it goes right back for me to what we were talking about at the beginning, the sanctity of human life. You know, if you allow all of these things to unravel, you know, you start out by saying, oh, well, if you have to shuffle barefoot through a metal detector and get patted down by someone you don't know, that's okay. And it's a ever decreasing circle, a spiral downwards. Yeah. And where you end up with, I think possibly to take us back to the beginning, is where we are now, where we've lost the awe around the sanctity of the individual human life.
Yes, absolutely. We need to go back to the divine, and this way of behaving where you're talking about what is legal, not what is moral, is straining out gnats and swallowing camels, as we heard in the Bible. You know, it's the hypocrisy of it. People saying, well, it's legal, it's perfectly right. And we all know in our gut it's not right. So I agree that we need to have the sanctity of humanity embraced in divinity, and we need to look higher, like Greg's doing, you know, higher and deeper, and question our soul, not just question what we're reading and seeing physically.
Jasmine, as the pleasure of listening to Ralph there, also the pleasure of listening to you this evening. I love it when it gets onto that philosophical note where we get back to the eternal verities. Yes. So thank you. You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you to all of my guests, Jasmine in particular, and to Ralph, and to Greg, and to everyone who is here with us today. We'll be back next week, inshallah.